Today is October the 5th, 2021, and that is the 10th anniversary of Steve Jobs' death. So we're going to talk about the impact that he had on the world. This is Steve Jobs' Dent in the Universe. I'm Dave, and I simplify Apple so that everything just works for you. And if you want the latest Apple news, leaks and rumours every weekday at 12 UTC, like this video, subscribe to the channel and ring my bell. So if you're an Apple fan that has come to Apple over the past few years, you might not be aware of some of the stuff that Steve did that has kind of created a lot of the world that we live in to this day. So we're going to just talk through a few of those little points, starting off with GUI interfaces. Now, you might not even be familiar with what GUI means, but the fact that you have Windows on your computer, whether you use a Mac, you use Windows, or you use Linux, and you're not just using a command line, that is a GUI interface, a graphical user interface. Now, this was not necessarily invented by Apple, but by the guys over at Xerox PARC, which Steve and his team visited back in the day and took a lot of inspiration from what they were doing. A lot of the stories say that it was stolen, but actually the whole point of this place was it was a research area, and it was to create these ideas for others to use. It was not something that Xerox was going to develop themselves. Also, when Steve was in college, he decided he didn't want to actually go to the classes that he was supposed to go to, and was just auditing classes, and one of them that he went to was calligraphy, and he credits this with the reason that he brought proportionally spaced fonts to the Mac as well, and basically the options for having different fonts on your screen. At the time, computers just had mono-spaced fonts where every letter was the same width as you went across the screen. It wasn't very beautiful, and Steve wanted that to be fixed. So without Steve, we probably wouldn't have mouse interface graphical computers to use. And one of the biggest things that this meant was that personal computing actually happens. When you look back at the original Apple computer, the Apple I, it was put together by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, but you basically just got a board, and then you would add your own inputs and all that kind of thing. This was sold to like the homebrew computer clubs. And when Steve realised that this is something that people would actually want, he insisted that they created fully built computer systems that they could actually sell as a usable computer from the beginning, in its own case with a keyboard and everything integrated, and sold it to local computer shops. But the PC really became far more personal, the personal computer, with the Macintosh, which was the first of the Apple computers really to popularise that graphical user interface, when we saw that 1984 introduction, and all of a sudden it wrote hello across the screen in what looked like a handwritten font. It absolutely blew people's minds. But Steve didn't have most of his impact on the world just while he was at Apple. When Steve left Apple, he was kind of forced out of his own company at the time. He went off and funded Pixar. So Pixar at the time was the graphics group from George Lucas's LucasFilm company. He funded it with his own money until they were able to get a deal with Disney. They got a production deal for 3 movies with Disney for $26 million, which of course started with the iconic Toy Story that just absolutely blew people's minds at the time. Remember, this came out in 1995 as a completely computer-generated movie from start to finish, feature length, and it absolutely blew people's minds at the time. Nobody had seen anything like it. The success of Toy Story allowed Steve to renegotiate with Disney on a few occasions, and at one point was ready to walk away until Bob Iger, the new CEO at Disney, replacing Michael Eisner, realised that in the Disney parades, pretty much all of the characters from the past decade were Pixar characters and not characters that Disney actually owned. So he got in touch with Steve, they discussed things and arranged a buyout of Pixar to the tune of $7.4 billion. That $7.4 billion was pretty much in Disney stock and made Steve the single largest shareholder of the Disney company, with a seat on their board as a result. And really there was nobody else even thinking about doing full-length computer animated movies, in the same way that in the 20s there was nobody thinking that they should do full-length animated movies, which Disney did with Snow White. Steve Jobs and Pixar massively changed the landscape in terms of the movies that we see today. Next up, Next, basically at the same time that Steve was running Pixar alongside the guys John Lasseter and everyone else, he was also setting up Next Computer, which was his follow-up to Apple, I guess. And the Next Computer was designed as what was called a 3M computer. It was quite high-end at the time, and the 3Ms were 1 megabyte of RAM, 1 megapixel display, and 1 megaflop of processing power. Now, this was incredibly powerful for the time, ran about $10,000, I think it was $9,999, and that works out to about $20,000 today. These were aimed at educational institutions, but some of them also found their way into research places, like, for example, CERN, where a gentleman by the name of Tim Berners-Lee set up the world's first web server at CERN on a Next Cube. So Tim Berners-Lee basically devised and implemented the world's first web browser and web server, and helped foster the web's subsequent explosive development. And he's currently the director of the W3 Consortium, developing tools and standards to further the web's potential. Next was then actually bought out by Apple, mainly for its NextStep Operating System, which would become basically the bedrock upon which future versions of macOS would be created. So I guess, to a degree, without Steve Jobs, we probably wouldn't have the internet as we have it today, the World Wide Web. Although I think Tim Berners-Lee probably gets some of the credit here. Next up, the smartphone. Again, Apple did not create the first smartphone. There were smartphones beforehand. They weren't as smart, but they did exist. The big difference is becoming that slab of glass, because we saw smartphones before, and as Steve pointed out in the original iPhone kind of announcement, the big problem with them all was...
What's wrong with their user interfaces? Well, the problem with them is really sort of in the bottom 40 there. It's this stuff right here.
Where they were covered in physical hardware buttons, they were covered in physical keyboards, and that kind of thing, which just basically couldn't get out of the way when you wanted to use the phone itself as something else. The original iPhone was introduced as being
an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices, and we are calling it iPhone.
That whole layout of having just this huge expanse of glass where you would have a virtual keyboard coming in, that was basically an absolute revolution. When you look at what smartphones look like before the iPhone and what they look like very, very quickly after the iPhone, you can see kind of where things changed. But the iPhone itself was not being developed until after multi-touch, and basically the original iPad was kind of developed first, but then put on the back burner because the phone was going to be a much bigger product. Then the iPad itself, as it came to be known, came back and became the kind of revolution in low-cost computing.
Is there room for a third category of device in the middle? Something that's between a laptop and a smartphone. Those devices are going to have to be far better at doing some key tasks. If there's going to be a third category of device, it's going to have to be better at these kinds of tasks than a laptop or a smartphone. Otherwise, it has no reason for being. Some people have thought that that's a netbook. The problem is, netbooks aren't better at anything.
You could get these Asus EPCs and that kind of thing that were a couple of £100, maybe £300, and they were a bit too small, and they had a cramped keyboard, and they had a poor quality display, no real power. And then he showed their version of what the middle ground could be, and it was the iPad. It was this beautiful piece of glass that could become whatever you wanted it to, whether it's a newspaper, a video player. The original iPads didn't have cameras, by the way. They were very much a consumption device. Now, obviously, this has changed quite a lot, but I think tablet computing, and iPad still absolutely dominates in this space. It's another space that Steve Jobs and his vision absolutely revolutionized. And I think that the world would be a very different place if we hadn't had his input on that kind of market. So I'd love to hear what you think Steve's biggest contributions would be. We're going to move into some of your questions from the comments section, and the first one is actually really interesting too. as this one comes from Team Kinetics, who asks, iCave answers, how different do you think Apple's current product lineup would look if Steve Jobs was still running Apple? Love the look of the new iCave, by the way. And I do think this is an interesting question, because we've looked at what he did before, but what would he do if he was still here? So I think there's a few areas that would be very, very different if we still had Steve around. For one thing, I think every year, right now we're getting 4 iPhones, maybe 5 iPhones if we get an SE. I think Steve would be releasing 1 iPhone a year. And I know that sounds crazy, but Steve's philosophy was always to release the best phone that you could, and that was really as far as he went. The first year where they actually managed to move out from having a single iPhone model was actually a couple of years after his death, when the iPhone 5C was introduced alongside the 5S. Now, the 5S was the first iPhone to have a 64-bit processor inside, and the 5C was actually designed, it was the first iPhone designed to be a budget iPhone, so kind of the first SE in all honesty, with a plastic shell and using the iPhone 5's internals basically. Didn't have Touch ID, didn't have any of that. So I think that that was kind of the first time that Apple branched off away from what Steve would have done. He always wanted to do 1 iPhone and make it the best iPhone that you could have. By the same token, I think we would have 1 iPad, and it would probably be what we would now call the iPad Pro. Maybe in a couple of sizes, I'm not 100% sure even on that, because Steve was very much against going to the iPad mini size. He thought that the iPad in its 9.7-inch size was basically the perfect size for an iPad, and that does make a lot of sense, even with the latest iPad mini that's just been released with its 8.3-inch display. A lot of reviewers are saying this is actually too small, everything has to be scaled down, and it doesn't have its own operating system. Steve wanted to have a full-size keyboard basically on screen, and that's about as small as you can go, is that 9.7-inch display. So I don't think we would have gone any smaller than that. We might have gone a little bit bigger, probably not quite up to the 12.9-inch iPad Pros. Steve was also famously against the stylus.
What are we going to do? Oh, a stylus, right? We're going to use a stylus. No. No. Who wants a stylus? You have to get them and put them away, and you lose them. Yuck. Nobody wants a stylus. So let's not use a stylus.
But at the time, that was basically because having that touch screen, everyone expected that you would have a stylus for picking out your letters. What Apple did was actually revolutionize the touch interface to have that capacitive touch interface, and the keyboard itself changes the size of your touch targets for different letters based on what word it thinks you're trying to spell. Which is a very clever way of doing it, and basically is the main reason that they didn't need a stylus in the early days. So I think what we're saying here is that Apple would really have used a lot more of the simple stick. Steve was always known for having this simple stick mentality, where he would take any idea that was getting a bit too complicated and hit it with the simple stick, try and make it simple again. Simplicity is one of his kind of core values, especially according to Insanely Simple, which is a book by a guy called Ken Siegel, who was involved in the naming of the iMacs and things like that. I don't think we would have ever seen an iMac Pro. I think that kind of sits outside of Steve's grid of products that he would have had.
When we got to the company a year ago, there were a lot of products. These were the product platforms, 15 product platforms, and a zillion variants of each one. I couldn't even figure this out myself. After about 3 weeks, I said, how are we going to explain this to others when we don't even know which products to recommend to our friends? If we had 4 great products, that's all we need. And as a matter of fact, if we only had 4, we could put the A-team on every single one of them. And if we only had 4, we could turn them all every 9 months instead of every 18 months.
Certainly based on the way that Steve set up his product categories, the iMac was always the consumer version of the desktop computer. The Mac Pro or the Power Macs, those were your Pro version, and then the iMac was really a consumer-based device. So doing an iMac Pro, having the I at the beginning, doesn't really make too much sense with the way that Steve liked to categorize his products. I also think he probably would have killed the Beats brand in general. Once it was bought, they were bought really more for their streaming expertise and a little bit of their street cred and how to do cool headphones, because they were making headphones that didn't cost a great deal to make and selling them for a great markup. Apple likes that kind of thing. But from Apple's point of view, the audio setup that they've got right now with AirPods, AirPods Pro, AirPods Max and HomePod actually fits into the grid really quite well. So for out and about, you've got your standard AirPods as your consumer device and your AirPods Pro as your Pro device, and then for at home, like at the desk, you've got the HomePod Mini as the consumer device, and then you've got the AirPods Max as basically your Pro audio for at home. That makes a lot more sense. And I think the quadrant model would probably have come back as well. So at the moment, there's quite a lot of different Mac models, and I think Steve would probably have just brought those down a little bit, kept it a bit more simple in the lineup. So next question comes in from Marcin Kowalczyk. ICave answers, is it reasonable to think that Apple is going to stick to OLED for iPhones for now and push mini LED across the larger lineup? Mini/micro LED is the ultimate goal for the entire lineup. Yeah, I would say that is probably the goal at the moment. I think OLED works really well for the iPhones because they don't have a screen that stays on persistently for a great deal of time, and when it is being used you don't have any persistent features other than things like maybe the time at the top of the screen, so that reduces the worry of screen burn-in and all that kind of stuff. Makes a lot of sense. Mini LED/micro LED makes so much more sense for the bigger displays. You don't get the OLED burn-in that you would get on things like the title bar that you would have on the screen of a Mac for a lot of the time, and also things like the dock. It just saves a lot of that burn-in issue from happening, which is a good thing. James Apple asks, would you ever upgrade to the iPad Pro over your iPad Air if they include a mini LED on the 11-inch M2 iPad Pro? Listen, I don't have a problem with the iPad Pros. They just are more powerful than I need in an iPad. My iPad is for things like a bit of note-taking, a bit of watching YouTube when I'm, I don't know, in the kitchen rather than at my desk. I take it with me for work to show things like product brochures and that kind of thing. I don't necessarily need to have the most powerful iPad in the world. It just isn't something that's that important to my life. However, if the pricing was good and you could have a better display, then sure, I'd be more than happy to change. But I don't really need to spend the extra for what I need. This iPad Air will probably do me for the next 5 years, I would guess. Tim Kinetics asks, ICave answers regarding the battery life on iOS 15. Apparently there's a battery drain issue with Spotify that could be causing my higher than usual battery leak. Is this a good time to switch to Apple Music? What are the pros and cons of Apple Music? Now, honestly, I've never been a Spotify subscriber, so I can't really give you much in terms of pros and cons versus that. But Apple Music, for me, it just integrates perfectly with everything else that I do because everything I use is Apple. I have the Apple Music subscription for the family plan because we have the Apple One premium subscription, so we've got the fitness thing, we've got the News Plus, we've got Arcade for the kids, all that kind of stuff. So it works really well for us. I think the interface is fine. I know a lot of people prefer the interface on Spotify and prefer the discovery on that side as well. But typically I'm wanting to listen to stuff that I know I like already, not looking for new music. So, you know, for me it works, and because of the integration that's really good with Siri when you're in the car and that kind of thing to put on the music that I want to listen to, that tends to be the reason that I use it. But your mileage will vary. And Lit8 asks, ICave answers, can you remove the plants, stickers, pictures so that basically it's just boxes and the products? No, I like my new set. I'm keeping it. Sorry. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching today. We are expecting the announcements of next week's Apple event later today. Fingers crossed. If we get that, I will throw up a video quite quickly just to let you know what's going on with it. And thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one.